Okay, we are live. Also, we are Memorex. Also, no one gets that joke anymore.
I got that joke.
All right, so you had things you wanted to say about Arlo, but let's introduce yourself first.
Hi, I'm Berman. I attempt to instruct people in saber at Scholar St. George, Dallas. I say attempt because I am not, I'm not a maestro. I haven't gone to the Sonoma classes or anything like that. I just found some rad alien stuff and figured this is really cool. I want to start doing it and find some friends that do it.
But you did have a background.
Somewhat, yeah. A guy that I worked with, a fantastic guy named John Eldridge, he was actually taught Goggler under, I believe, Maestro Sullins. Anyway, I was sitting there in the office one day, dying, staring at an Excel spreadsheet, and he walked by and he goes, "You want to learn how to hit people with stuff?" And I, of course, said, "Absolutely." And the next day he came in with a Hanwei Pecoraro and an epee and proceeded to teach me verbally Goggler, and it was a lot of fun. He then moved back home to California and left me the saber and a fencing mask as a way of guilting me into continuing the art. He basically said, no one does this. Like, if you search on the internet, there's not very many people teaching it. There's even less, material available. So, it's kind of your responsibility now to spread what little you have. And he also gave me one of Holtzman's, his translation of Pecoraro and Pacina. And yeah, very confused me. Several years later, has been devouring most of Holtzman's stuff and then some of your rad alien stuff as well that has crossed over. And so, yeah, trying to mash it all together and teach it to people.
All right, so you have things you want to say about Arlo, and I'm not primarily known for rad alien stuff because my rad alien stuff tends to be taught to the lightsaber kids, which is hilarious fun. But
that's fantastic. I still love that.
Rad alien lightsaber for the win.
I mean, that would be your argument then for, well, the rad aliens, it only works because they're using these big handguards. It's like, no, here, this lightsaber has no handguard.
No, it works for anything you want.
Yeah. Arlo was really interesting. I've read the Pecoraro and Pacina translation by Holtzman, his Art of the Dueling Saber, which was Del Frate. Both are good. I've read Art of the Saber and the Epee by Barbasetti, and all those are really good, but they're also very dense, and I, like Kat, don't read nonfiction very well, but Arlo has this very practical approach that really resonated with me in a way perhaps that I just understand it better. But he also strangely, there's that nationalistic fervor there, but I think that's also part of his charisma because he's trying to say, hey, there's a better way. Like, we've been fencing the same way forever. These guys came in and they kicked our asses, and there's like some really cool stuff they're doing, but we can also preserve what we consider to be, the soul of the Hungarian fencer, right? And so he puts some interesting additional things on the rad alien system, like the false edge cuts, for example, that I find really compelling. So yeah, I'm about 3/4 of the way through it, halfway through it, and I'm really liking what I'm seeing so far.
So for you, 3/4 of the way through means not just skimming, but actually playing with, right?
Trying to. I'm going to start trying to actually apply the lessons from Arlo and from Art of the Dueling Saber as well, to try and walk people through some of this stuff now, once we get the basics down.
So I'm glad you mentioned false edge cuts while we're sitting here talking. And this isn't an interview like I just did with Kat. This is more of a, we want to shoot our mouths off about Arlo because it's great. And I obviously have a vested interest in you buying it. But Corey said, people should read this. And I want to get on camera and tell people that. So we're just going to blab about it on camera. I'm glad you mentioned false edge cuts. So what about the false edge cuts strikes you as interesting?
So what initially grabbed me is when he mentions them, he says they're pretty much like very much part of the soul of Hungarian fencing. They love using the false edge, which from you, that makes sense. But he says, something that was really compelling to me was he says that they're as fast as a thrust, right? And coming from someone who's read Barbasetti's book, who says, very famously, the thrust is the best form of attack, right? Induces the opponent to act, but also they're very quick. That immediately was like, how do I get into positions where I use this false edge cut?
We have a dog who may or may not wander on the camera, so if you see me with the Punisher, that's why.
But yeah, those false edge cuts, like when he says how quick they are, and in some cases how easy they are to perform, it sort of started the wheels turning into, okay, well, how many of these engagements do I have when I perform a parry where a very easy riposte would be a false edge cut, or even a first intention attack? So that I thought was worth exploring.
You've parried me. It's time for false edge remise.
Right.
Yeah, it's nice too. Oh, here's a standard parry, but you don't know the false edge, or you would have structured that parry differently. Cut.
Right. And I think, too, a curved blade also benefits that as well. Because it seems, I have two sabers, one is more straight, the other's more curved, and it seems like I'm able to get that edge around a little bit better on some of the curves, but again, very novice in it.
So for Hungarian fencing, the sort of primordial form of the saber is also the one that's mostly being advocated for. It has a slightly canted handle, and it has a mild curve, so that it's still very useful for thrusting, but you have that advantage of the curve, and you can hide behind it, and you can weaponize the false edge with it. And the slight cant to the handle means that your point, while not being in line with your hand, is more or less in parallel with your hand, which makes it very convenient for thrusting.
Sort of like this, or?
Similar to that, but with a slightly thicker grip usually.
Okay.
And Arlo lays out the difference between how you grip with the thenar eminence versus the hypothenar eminence, depending on whether you have a thicker or a thinner grip.
Right.
Because you can pick up anything and use it with this.
Which I think is another thing we wanted to kind of talk about, right? Which is there's this belief that the Italian system, the Radialians, right? These are all just these effete little sort of tiny sabers that, you know, wouldn't really stand up on a battlefield or anything like that. That there's this belief, I think, in a lot of HEMA saber, right, that, you know, a true martial blade is a very heavy, almost, you know, one would say too heavy saber to be fenced in any of these ways.
Hold on, I have something right nearby I can use that I just love ranting about. This is an old school, very martial, the tip has been broken and ground back down, saber. 1790s roughly. Yeah, how much that weighs?
I would say this is probably lighter than my, I've got a Franken saber, so it's got the Hanwei Pecoraro guard and then a 20 millimeter cast steel blade on it. I would say this is probably lighter.
Yeah, that's 490 grams.
So that's MOF legal.
Yes, you can show up to the Olympics, and when they're done shitting themselves and calling for security, and you say, hey, let's electrify it.
Yeah, no, that's perfect.
Yeah, it fits within their weight requirements because, oh, look, they have a really nice fuller, and it takes the weight down dramatically.
So that's 20 grams lighter than my Franken saber.
Yeah.
Because my Franken saber is a 510.
Now, granted, if you had a big protective student fencing bowl guard on it, it would go way higher. It's got a little stirrup hilt because it's not a training weapon. You don't see giant training weapon hilts on issue weapons. Even the M1904, which has a pretty sizable basket, it's way smaller than big baskets with lobes and stuff.
Right.
But even if you're out in 9,000 grams or 1,000 grams or the big heavy cavalry whacking blades, which at this point he's talking about, you're talking about something like the M1904, sometimes weighs in at 1,300 grams. We're talking about Haas sabers, 2.5 pounds if you're in Imperial units.
So these are basically issue weapons.
Yeah.
So
you can do anything you want in the system. The difference is the actions just have to be simplified. And if you're a fencing instructor who's been teaching this for 20, 30 years, it's boring. It's red paper, green stamp, blue box. You can't do the more involved stuff with the much heavier weapon. And oh, by the way, your recruit's arms wear out, so you can't get the length of lesson you'd like. So use a lighter blade for training. It's as simple as that. There's nothing that says you can't use a system like this. The 1796 is actually patterned off of Austro-Hungarian weapons. We have big cavalry sabers.
okay.
The French are using, for example, their Year of the New Republic 9 sabers. They're beautiful sabers. They're really well-made sabers. It's not an accident that the French, having taken their hussar tradition from the Hungarians and the Croatians, have that same, oh look, here's a medium to mild curve, here's a canted handle. They add 3 bars because the French don't learn to train ambidextrously for the most part. They tend to stay righty or lefty. The bars protect the right side of the hand, so they don't insist on an ambidextrous guard the way the Italians and Hungarians do. They also don't use the false edge much. But you can very clearly use almost the entire corpus. You're just not going to get into double feints with a weapon that heavy. You'll use a single feint and then try to draw them out. And then if you have to, after that, use a second intention attack.
Gotcha. No, I think that's, like I can't tell you the number of times. I've actually had to start prefacing my introduction to Red Alien Saber as this is actually a military saber system. It's not going to, like you said, change too much of what you're doing. It's just going to change, again, you're not going to be doing 2 or 3 feints with this thing.
Yeah, no, it's not an accident that the first people who pick up Red Alien fencing is the Austro-Hungarian army for its cavalry guys. This was not just flipping around civilian areas for civilian dueling purposes. This was being adopted by cavalry people who said, hey, elbow moulinet, this is really good stuff. We need to consider this. And there's a lot of back and forth over who prefers the wrist, who prefers the elbow, some of it nationalistic, some of it technical.
Right.
But this is military stuff.
And I think that's important that people realize that, because all too often when I hear the words military saber in a HEMA context, people are almost exclusively, referring to Roworth or maybe Hutton. That's, I would say, 80 to 90% of those times. We're finally entering an era where more things are finally getting translated, but I would still say that's the predominant reference.
The irony of which is you can make an argument, and you can make a very solid argument, that Roworth's lineage is less military.
I would love to.
Derived from, well, you're talking about fencing that is primarily derived from the House of Angelo.
Okay.
And while they did indeed instruct military fencers, most of what they were up to was small sword fencing. They were engaged in fencing for the sake of fencing, because it's complete by and for itself. It doesn't have to be justified in terms of everything else. Whereas Radaeli was a military guy in a military institution creating a system of saber for explicitly military purposes, there wasn't any small sword there. There wasn't even any foil there until they had to shoehorn it in.
That's interesting.
Yeah, so, and that's not to trash talk Hutton and Roworth. Well, okay, I'm going to trash talk Hutton on a constant basis. I think he was a poser, and I'm already known for that, so I'm not going to do myself any reputational damage that way. And his stuff that's not cold steel is better. But I don't think it's an accident either that the British Army looked at Masiello and said, yeah, we're adopting that, and Hutton screamed bloody murder, and the Army went, who's that guy? Why do we care? No, this isn't a fait accompli, it's done.
Yeah, I don't think Roworth per se, I too do not like Hutton. I look at his stuff and I'm like, this is, like, it's like Radaeli, but like Bizarro World.
Hey, there's 17 parries. I'm not going to tell you why you should prefer any of them. And also, half of them are going to be false edge foil parries. I'm totally going to block a 1,200 gram service weapon with that.
Right. Yeah.
It's nonsense. You're not having a parry that's literally structured here and stopping a 1,300 gram saber being swung at you on horseback with this. It's not happening.
It doesn't feel great.
To put it mildly, on foot with lightweight training sabers.
But I don't like Roworth. I think it's overly simplistic, but I will say that, I don't think it's bad. I would, the best analogy I would think of is like Roworth to me is like a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. And I love peanut butter and jelly sandwich. Like, you can ask my wife. I probably eat wholly too much peanut butter. But if I go to a steakhouse, I'm probably not going to get a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, despite the fact that it's probably going to be a good sandwich. I want something more out of it.
I'd go one up on you and say it's a really good grilled cheese sandwich with mustard, the way a grilled cheese sandwich should be made.
We will have to make a separate video about this.
I'll have my daughter make you one, and then we can talk it out, okay? The mustard interacts with the cheese in a way that's just different. And until you've had it, it's like the people who poo-poo pineapple on pizza, which is an abomination, I admit, but it's a tasty abomination. Now, the reason I classify it one step up from a PB&J is that Roworth is very clear about saying, hey, you need some basic lessons so you don't embarrass yourself with a saber. Here are some very basic lessons. By the way, when you're done this, if you want to continue fencing, go get some real training. So he's not advertising this as anything other than solid basics. With one aside, that as a body mechanics guy, just don't make your cuts from the wrist the way he's advocating. Because yes, it'll do you fine for 6 months of service and then you're done. But if you're doing it on a constant basis, that's an injury, that's usage injury waiting to happen. Eventually you have to learn how your shoulder blade and the rotation of your upper arm can make this a point of passive articulation while the power is coming from all these big back muscles. I mean, it's not an accident that fencers tend to have relatively small guns but relatively strong backs.
And I mean, how many times have we been in the HEMA Discord and someone pops in the saber channel and says, "Hey, my wrist and or my forearm are, killing me, and I've been doing these things. How do I fix this?"
And the first thing we say is, "Hey, were you doing row worth?"
Right.
And every single time it turns out to be yes.
Right.
Yeah. So repair the body mechanics and learn how your upper arm and your back muscles actually work. But in his era, you couldn't fault him for that. He is taking a very basic manual for purposes of you can do credible fencing without an instructor, and if you're going to run with it further, go learn small sword, go learn foil, go learn where your footwork does. Good grilled cheese sandwich. It's not a steak. It's simplistic as hell compared to even to guys like Timlick, who are publishing in more or less the same era. Timlick's saber on foot is an order of magnitude more sophisticated, even if he's just cutting in the air, because of the way he's matching the footwork and the blade work and how to work that in an environment where you're almost certainly going to have multiple opponents. Because if you're a dismounted cuirassier, you are already officially having a bad day trademark.
There's probably several angry infantrymen that want to settle the score, perhaps.
They'd like to go home, and capturing you with a bayonet is a good way of doing it.
Yeah?
Yeah, and if they club you upside the kneecap and that puts you out of combat so they can stop worrying about it,
Right.
That's fine for them. They didn't want to be in this war in the first place. They were told at gunpoint, hey, sign up for the war.
Right.
That's the way most conscripts wind up.
And I mean, I guess it makes sense too, right? If I have 50 or 100 guys and I now have to get them ready to swing swords at people, I probably am not going to try and start teaching them the intricacies of a deeper system when I really just need them to, I need to swing the blade, I need it to not be flat when you swing it, and I need you to be able to at least parry the first couple of shots that are going to come your way. That's it.
Well, and that's where my lineage comes in. It is a living lineage, and it's significantly more sophisticated than Roworth. And it was trooper fencing. It was, you're a hussar, you're doing your basic fencing. Now, as Bartunek often laments, it was in an era where the educational system of the Austro-Hungarian army had basically fallen apart in its central administration to the point where every single fencing instructor is just doing it their own way. They're divided between the so-called French and Italian moulines from the wrist or from the elbow, and there's lots of hybrid systems creating.
So at that time, there's no real manual they're all working from. It's almost, they've all diverged almost like different dialects of a same language, basically.
If you are getting teacher course instruction, you're getting it in Wiener Neustadt, or you're getting it at very specific academies, and you're learning a very centralized corpus. But we know that there were also lots of people on military installations who were teaching. They had had a crash course, they got sent home to their units, and they often didn't have the benefit of 3 years of instruction after their crash course. You have a controversy about what's what and how saber fencing should evolve. Well, they're teaching horsemen. They have a limited amount of time per day. They have limited infrastructure. Sometimes they're doing it in barns, literally. Many of these military installations don't have fancy infrastructure and certainly don't have the kind of showers and stuff Arlo is talking about for, well-to-do people in central Pest.
Right.
They're training in their cavalry boots. They have to come up with something that works. By the way, you're not busting out with a balestra lunge with your cavalry boots unless you've done a really good job softening the ankles. You don't have the flexion.
And they hopefully fit.
They hopefully fit, and they hopefully weren't made of paper.
And so, backing up, what time frame is this kind of in where this fragmentation has occurred?
This fragmentation is happening in the late 19th century.
So this is almost kind of...
The same period. Bartunek is publishing, for example, I think his Ratgebers in 1896. Same period this whole thing is going on. Because the army knows it has to reform, but it doesn't manage to do so in a centralized basis that's as consistent as they preferred. So every instructor is centered doing their own thing. And to an extent, they already had the responsibility and right to do that. You look at how cosmopolitan Austro-Hungarian fencing is, and it's insane. You have German and French and Italian theory rubbing shoulders with native Hungarian ideas of the false edge, etc., and everybody takes that for granted. In stark contrast to the French, who have a highly specialized and highly centralized lineage, and if you're doing official fencing, you're doing what the dudes in Paris with the royal writs, or later on the official writs, are saying you are. Or if you're in Britain and you're past the era of the broadsword players, everything derives from Angelo, because they basically only have one big fencing lineage. Now you have offshoots here and there, and you have really good fencers who are offshoots. But quote-unquote official fencing is all surrounding the House of Angelo. You don't have a lot of extra lineages floating around. Hutton is trying his damnedest to bring ideas of continental play in. The problem is he's nowhere near as competent as he thinks he is. He's a dilettante. He describes what he's convinced is the cutting-edge stuff, doesn't realize he's advocating for the things that have been soundly rejected by the Italians for cavalry play. Everyone takes Parise seriously for foil. That's why they'll write hundreds of pages to scrutinize and analyze and reject every bit of it, because that's where you give respect to get respect, is you critique it. No one even bothers critiquing Parise's saber. They sort of snicker at it and go, okay, yes, we know he's a political appointee, moving on. And later on, Parise and Pecoraro say, hey, there were good elements of them. We're keeping those good elements.
Pecoraro and Pessina.
Pecoraro and Pessina, yes, sorry. And they create what's not quite what Del Frate is talking about, still recognizably Radaelian, but not quite the same. Why are those guards so point forward?
Yeah, and they themselves call it a mixed system.
Yeah.
But I think what was interesting, kind of going back to what you were talking about just a second ago, was that, you know, because of that fragmentation, Hungary was basically, or Austro-Hungary was basically sort of bolting on their own ideas and fencing culture and skills to existing sources from a variety of different places.
Oh, yeah.
So, kind of building off that, what do you think that Arlo brings to the Radaelian Italian system that is uniquely Hungarian or interesting?
Well, you can't underestimate the false edge cuts.
Right.
I mean, just point blank. There is no difference I can point to that is bigger than the ability to immediately remise with the false edge, bypass a significant number of parries, or use their parries as your I win button. I mean, you can't. The Italians say, yes, we use false edge cuts, but they use them a lot less than they say they do. Once you get into Italo-Hungarian fencing, the false edge comes into its own in the rest of Europe in a way that just hadn't before. Arlo also does everybody a favor by insisting that high second is worth fencing from. High second is a fabulous guard. Even without a hand guard, I tend to use it with my Radaelian lightsaber classes, because it's just really, really handy to have your blade up here and have the ability to make all the plays that come out of it. Whereas if I'm here to go lefty, second is really good. Second is really, really good, but then I have to cover up here.
Right, and so I guess for the...
Whereas Lassac will say, okay, roll 7, go, and it's completely in line with Del Frate's basic Moulinet practice. Arlo's response is, you don't have to roll 7. It's a newfangled thing. People are playing with it. You can just roll to high second.
Right.
Your point's never left its position. So you've immediately got the thrust. And oh, by the way, lock their blade out. Guess what you've immediately got? You've got a false edge cut as you go circular second or circular third. You've got all kinds of cool stuff lined up for an immediate riposte.
And so just because it's not confusing enough with the 15 seconds that we have already in Radaelian saber, you're talking about the, you know, Radaeli's guard of second, usually the arm is about shoulder, and then there's, you know, some debate on where exactly this angle falls, but then
yeah, point should be at the opponent. For Radaelian, point should be at the opponent's hip.
Right.
The Hungarians take it lower.
Okay.
And I'm convinced, although people disagree with me in places because of passaggio issues or what do you do with your fingers on the saber, I'm convinced it's because they tend to hold the weapon more like this and less like that. And that makes second point down more and more useful as a load defense rather than gripping here. Even if I change the angles around, this is more useful as a point at their hip guard. This seals off the low line completely.
Right. And so you're saying basically that high second is basically, it's kind of that same line, but up higher.
Yeah, high second if I'm here, and if I'm gripping on the thenar or eminence with a thicker grip. So here's my regular second, for Hungarian. There's my Radialian second. There's high second. So here I am, the blow comes in, I need to shield that side, I just do that. And oh, by the way, it's extremely useful for coming to here and threatening with the point. And if he really wants to roll it higher because he's seen my response, I'm just in the scabbard, so I'm going to have to thumb the key ins here.
Sure.
I can roll to third as a continuation of that very, very easily in case he reads my parry and wants to go around it. Okay. So it maintains the ability to stay within the own system. Whereas seventh is more the bolted on kludge, and it comes out of basic moulinet practice, so they make it work and they make it work well. But seventh has never wound up being really well integrated into Italo-Hungarian saber as it evolves later. Most modern fencers never practice seventh. And when you see somebody pulling off seventh in a tournament, you then get YouTube videos with, holy shit, someone's doing seventh, you may recall from last year, where some gal landed 5 or 6 ripostes from seventh in a row because their opponent literally had no idea what to do after somebody had taken them in seventh and come around for the riposte.
I think there was a video I saw of Kevin Murakoshi out of California fencing, and he actually was, he fenced out of seventh a couple times. He would catch a parry instead of going, and in each case it seemed like that was a situation where I would just normally have gone to third, but he just rolls seventh and then hits.
Yeah.
And it was, I guess it works for some people, but from the Italo-Hungarian perspective, if I want to threaten with a point or if I want to use the false edge, then I guess high second is, objectively better.
High second, I think so. Now, Lesac doesn't preserve high second. He goes with seventh. You see a lot of Italo-Hungarian sabers who will still go with seventh, but the more old school and serious they are about the blade work, the more you'll tend to see high second being included in the point and line work. The point and line work will be here, not here.
Right.
So Szilárd Járon, for example, he's constantly picking wrists as he backs out. And if you look at his blade position, he's in high second. And you can't argue, or nobody in HEMA Saber should say anything bad about technique of those guys playing at that level.
Right.
Especially somebody who's known for their quality blade work like Szilárd is.
I would say the only thing that they could find fault in is that the judges at tournaments probably can't see a false edge cut that often unless you're really slamming it and making a noise or something.
Last time I competed at Brass Frog, pre-COVID, actually Jeremy Steflik took the entire place and said, hey, you're going to see these cuts, and especially if you're a judge, keep an eye out for them because you're not used to seeing them. If you're not used to seeing it, you don't tend to judge it because of confirmation bias. One of the reasons I like thicker padded muffler type gloves over the heavy plastic gauntlets is you can tell when someone has landed one of those and is pulling what would be pulling a blade right through your hand. And taking your hand or wrist off. And we know that false edge cuts pulled hands off in duels.
Right.
Well, you can feel that through the padding. You can feel that through a very light plate and padding, like the newer Thox are using.
Right.
You can't feel that through a Spec Heavy. I've landed it a gazillion times on people with Spec Heavies who then went to stab me and was like, hey, why didn't you do that thing? Actually, I did.
Right.
Yeah, I was actually cutting your hand the whole time. And they're not rhinoing. They literally don't know they've been hit because the gauntlet's so protective that a slice falls out of the repertoire. It's one of my problems with the insistence on actually overprotective hand gear is that all the schnitz and slices have been completely devalued because unless you're really blatant about dumping your body weight into it, you can't tell you've been hit. And nobody wants to go be the fencer who gets a reputation for ignoring hits.
Right.
Especially if you haven't been trying to.
Right. Which brings us back to our grandmaster plan of just electrifying HEMA Saber because it's pure heresy and it will be entertaining.
It'd be super entertaining if you can agree on a consistent saber to get electrified.
No, we can't even agree on I don't actually think we agree on very much of anything in Hema Saber these days, to be honest with you. Which is fine. It's nice, but
Yeah, we're 20 years at least behind longsword. And in some ways that's a good thing, because the way longsword tourney or tourney longsword has evolved in a way that is really good for pressure testing. We've got more videos and content coming, so if you liked what you saw and it was useful for you, please stab the like button, /subscribe, and punch the little bell icon so that you're notified immediately when new content comes available. Thanks, and go do the thing.